Our subject today is one of the stories in this collection, The Maypole of Marymount by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne was, of course, one of America's great writers, and among its great writers, perhaps the most astute scholar and student of the American soul. Born in 1804 in Massachusetts, he lived the bulk of his life in his native New England and spent the bulk of his career writing about New England and through it about America. He's best known, perhaps, for his novels, and especially The Scarlet Letter, published in 1850. But he was also a prodigious author of short stories, many of them quite rich and wonderful stories, and many of them touching on American themes and on the American soul. That is certainly the case with the story we'll take up today. The Maple of Marymount, published in 1837, was part of a collection, his first published collection of short stories, called Twice Told Tales. And the story we'll take up, the author himself describes as sort of an allegory, which therefore invites us to take it up on various levels and to think through what it might be telling us beyond the details of the story itself, and especially what it might be telling us about the American story. Maybe the way to begin is to provide a kind of map, a road map of where the story goes. Diana, I wonder if I could ask you to start us off with a sort of guided tour.
Sure, I'd be happy to. This story was first published in 1837, but the story itself is set a full 2 centuries earlier, about 1630, at the time of the first English colonies in the New World. The story depicts an incident in the feud between the Puritans at Salem, under their governor, John Endicott, and a rival settlement called Marymount, founded by Thomas Morton. These two settlements represent different principles, really different stances toward the world. Hawthorne says that jollity and gloom were contending for an empire and that the future complexion of New England was involved in this important quarrel. So just to give a quick overview of the story opens with the people of Marymount. They're celebrating round their Maypole. Their wild festivities are to culminate with the marriage of a youth and a maiden named Edgar and Edith. They are the lord and lady of the Maypole. After introducing us to this young couple, Hawthorne, in the middle section of the story, provides a fuller description of the origins of the hedonistic philosophy of Marymount, as well as a description of the main features of the Puritans. Then the third and final section of the story depicts a Puritan raid upon Marymount. Endicott and his followers chop down the Maypole, as we can see behind us. They have the votaries whipped and placed in the stocks. They arrest the high priest of Marymount, and they kill the dancing bear. Most interesting, though, is what happens to the newlywed couple. Endicott, who is a man of iron, is softened by their obvious love and care for one another. He actually spares them the punishments that the others receive. Instead, he orders that they be dressed in more modest clothing. The youth has his hair cut in the true pumpkin shell fashion, and he takes them back into the Puritan fold. In the final paragraph, Endicott, the severest Puritan of all, salvages a wreath of roses from the Maypole itself and places it over the heads of Edith and Edgar.
Well, thank you very much. The story, from its title on, invites us first and foremost to think about Marymount and the Marymounters. Who are these people? What is the Maypole? Do we recognize them? Amy, do you know who they are?
Well, yes, I do know who they are. I recognize them. They're all around us. They're people who live to eat, drink, and be merry. But these take this to an extreme. They are like that all year long. So the Marymounters are described in the story as a wild throng. We're told that an outsider looking at them would describe them as a crew of Comus, an ancient god who's related to Bacchus or in Greek Dionysus. The aim is to look for utopia or no place, or to merge oneself with the elements of things. And while the Marymounters themselves will pursue happiness to an extreme, or in any way that they choose, they are also a community. And the thing that binds them is the Maypole. The Maypole is at the center of the community, and the Maypole is an object also of reverence for them.
So the permanent Maypole suggests a permanent festival. The community always in the midst of a permanent festival or a permanent spring.
There's an account given of the leaders of this band, and he talks about how people have come by the thousands to America, to the West, some for gain, some for conquest, some one stern band to pray. But the Marymounters are different. Their leaders were men who had sported so long with life that when thought and wisdom came, even these unwelcome guests were led astray by the crowd of vanities which they should have put to flight. Erring thought and perverted wisdom were made to put on masks and play the fool. The men of whom we speak, after losing the heart's fresh gaiety, imagined a wild philosophy of pleasure and came hither to act out their latest daydream. They gathered followers from all that giddy tribe whose whole life is like the festal days of soberer men. In their trains were minstrels, and actors, and mountebanks, and mummers. In a word, the mirth makers of every sort, such as abounded in that age, but now began to be discountenanced by the rapid growth of Puritans. They had light footsteps on land, lightly they came across the sea. Many had been maddened by their previous troubles into a gay despair. Others were madly gay in the flush of youth, like the May Lord and his lady. But whatever be the quality of their mirth, old and young were gay in Marymount. The young deemed themselves happy. The elder spirits, this is very interesting, if they knew that mirth was but the counterfeit of happiness, yet they followed the false shadow willfully, because at least her garments glittered brightest. Sworn triflers of a lifetime, they would not venture among the soberer truths of life, not even to be truly blessed. These are people who I think the older amongst them once had certain kinds of high hopes for something higher, perhaps, but they have seen into what they think is the dark truth of things. And I would modify Amy's formulation of eat, drink, and be merry, would be, well, eat, drink, dance, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. And this rush into the life of pleasure and the celebration of the present moment and the overcoming of all of the boundaries and distinctions, which in the end don't really mean anything anyhow, was, I think, a way, it was a kind of false joy covering over what is underlyingly a deeper despair.
That's said of their leaders.
It's said of their leaders.
Is there any evidence that they have death before their eyes?
I don't know. I mean, they throw themselves with abandon into the revelries and pleasures and wildnesses of the day. As you point out, when you see them around the Maypole, many of them are in costume, half human, half beasts. They even have a live bear joining in their dances. And the ones who are not quite so wild looking, nevertheless have the look of wild revelry on their face, as if they're getting ready to sort of merge and blur the difference between the human and the animal. It's not clear whether they have real deep thoughts about these things, but they're living for the exuberance of the moment and producing, to what a critic would say, is a kind of factitious happiness. It's not the genuine thing. It is a manufactured mirth and instant delight. It doesn't go very deep, but it sure takes away whatever pain there might be if you weren't doing this.
Hawthorne makes that point very nicely by using the word mirth instead of happiness or joy.
Yeah.
Mirth and jollity.
Yeah. The young among them seem to be genuinely happy in the way that children can be.
Right.
Yeah.
The old among them somehow mourn the loss of that youth by pretending to still possess it rather than by growing out of it. Does it make sense for a community to exist around this kind of ideal?
I think people make an attempt to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been communes in our own time where people wandered off from the humdrum rhythm of bourgeois life and family life to find a world of pleasure now and full satisfaction of desires.
Yeah, I guess I would say that it is not sustainable, and the example of Edith and Edgar shows that. In other words, it isn't, in a way, really the Puritans that destroy this community. It's, in fact, the love between Edith and Edgar. If I could throw a passage in, it says, from the moment that they truly loved, they had subjected themselves to earth's doom of care and sorrow and troubled joy, and had no more a home at Marymount.
Everyone who observes this marriage, from Hathorne to the bride and groom to the Puritans, seems to observe it with a kind of sorrow, with a sense that the joy that is here can't possibly last, and seems to take that to be the most powerful lesson of what they're observing. And it seems like this is a community of people who react to that understanding by pretending that it isn't true. And might not we make sense of the ceremony around this wedding as a way to try to help the bride and groom do that, find their way to ignoring the reality they've come to see in the course of their getting married by dancing with a bear and pretending that this can continue forever?
I think that's very, very nice. That this is their real initiation into the community in a way. This is their assimilation to revelry, and yet they defy that. I mean, by their expressions and by their seeming understanding. But to return to your original question, is this a real possibility, a lasting possibility?
Yeah.
No, it's not. This is a community that, what does it produce?
Yeah.
Flowers.
Mm-hmm.
There's very, how does one eat flowers?
Yeah. The story tells us, O people of the golden age, the chief of your husbandry was to raise flowers. What do we take this to mean? Flowers as opposed to
vegetables,
food?
as opposed to,
Yeah.
I mean, flowers could go so far,
Yeah.
but can it sustain over the years without a settlement, without settled ways, with this kind of monthly, if not daily revelry? It doesn't sound like a sustainable community to me.
I'm inclined to agree. I mean, some flowers go on to bear fruit. I mean, to be interested in the flower and not in the seed and not in the fruit is another way of saying one really wants just the bloom of things and nothing fruitful. And this is not, the fruitfulness of flowering is not on their minds. It's the beauty of the present moment. The problem, it seems to me, from the point of view of the community is not only that they don't plant and toil, but that they really give no thought to the future. They don't look beyond themselves to the task of perpetuating anything. It's true, and we have to take this seriously, that I mean, from the point of view of the Judeo-Christian ethic, you can call them pagans and dismiss them simply, but they have something like ritual, and they have something like a religion, and this is an altar of something visible and tangible, and they are paying some kind of respect to real natural powers of earthly growth and potency and fertility and the seasons and so on. This is a form of nature worship which is very widespread in the world, especially before the Bible, the people of the Bible came along.
Let's think about the Puritans briefly. The neighbors of the Marymounters, most unfriendly neighbors who we meet at first, and then after a brief digression into history, we find that they've interrupted the wedding for reasons that are not exactly given to us. Who are the Puritans? Why are they in the forest? And what kind of community do they seem to have?
Why don't we just let Hathorne describe them? Not far from Marymount was a settlement of Puritans, most dismal wretches, who said their prayers before daylight, and then wrought in the forest or the cornfield till evening made it prayer time again. Their weapons were always at hand to shoot down the straggling savage. When they met in conclave, it was never to keep up old English mirth, but to hear sermons 3 hours long, or to proclaim bounties on the heads of wolves and the scalps of Indians. Their festivals were fast days, and their chief pastime the singing of psalms. Woe to the youth or maiden who did but dream of a dance. The selectman nodded to the constable, and there sat the light-heeled reprobate in the stocks. Or if he danced, it was round the whipping post, which might be termed the Puritan Maypole.
Well,
Satire?
Well, no more satire than the presentation of the Marymounters.
Yeah,
In
I
other words,
think that's
there's
true.
a sort of extreme presentation of both alternatives.
and so what is it that they have that the Marymounters don't? In what sense, since we're given extreme versions of both, what is it really that distinguishes them?
Readers of the story would know, and we ought to know something about the Puritans, in addition to what Hawthorne does to them here in the story. The Puritans are a Protestant English sect. They believe that the Reformation in England had not gone far enough, that the Church of England was still too much like the Roman Catholic Church in its hierarchies, in its pomp and circumstance. While we now use the term Puritan to mean sort of anti-pleasure and straight-laced, I think if one wants to be fair to them, one would say that they aspired to a kind of purity and holiness in all of the affairs of daily life. Everything they did was for the glory of God. And in the Mayflower Compact, which they signed coming to America, which we have in the collection, that's indicated as their goal in covenanting with one another, not to come and exercise their unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you want to put the best construction on the Puritans, you say they believe that this is a God-given land on which they are to erect a holy community. And the Marymounters are pagans, worse than pagans. They are spirits of the devil who are defiling the land and should be removed.
Are those the Puritans we meet here? Or are those the Puritans as they would like to understand themselves? Isn't there a way in which the Marymounters might be the way the Puritans thought of people who lived under English priests, and the Puritans are the way that those people would have thought of Puritans, so that the story gives us a way of thinking about New England through the eyes of both parties?
Well, I think the paragraph which Amy read, which began, unfortunately, there were men in the New World of a sterner faith, is that Hawthorne's judgment that it was unfortunate, or is he speaking there, this is the way the Marymounters see it. Unfortunately, we're not the only people here. There are these killjoys. There's this party of gloom. All they want to do is pray in the morning, work all day, and pray in the evening. And they're darkening our happiness.
But answer Yuval's question. Your account of the Puritans, is that are those the Puritans that we meet in this story?
Not quite. Not quite by a lot. And I think
Because there's no theology here at all.
no, we don't
There's
get
only the gloom and the sternness and especially
Austerity.
the shame.
Is it unfair to describe the Puritans as pray in the morning, pray in the evening, and work all day? Wouldn't they have taken that as a compliment?
They would have taken that as a compliment. To work to erect here a kind of community that, it's true it's not said here, but that they're really animated by a kind of piety. They've come here to pray and to work
But
in
a
the
kind of piety that is so severe that it seems almost formidable, too formidable.
They seem to have gravity, where the Marymounters are described several times as light.
Tocqueville, who's writing at the same time about that Hawthorne is, admired the Puritans and thought that we inherited much of our character from the Puritans, but they're your Puritans. They're not Hawthorne's Puritans.
Right. Tocqueville calls it the point of departure for
Exactly.
America, and that you can really understand something about the American character by
Right.
understanding that point of departure. And Tocqueville's claim is that the Puritans united the spirit of religion
Religion and
with
spirit
the,
of liberty.
spirit of freedom. And yeah, Hawthorne is separating those two things to such an extent that he doesn't even really call this the spirit of religion. He says this is superstition.
As you've all said at the outset, Hawthorne indicates that this is a contest between these two parties for who shall have empire in New England? By the end of the story, we know the answer. Marymount is finished. The Puritans have won.
No, I
No.
don't read that.
Really?
No.
Right.
The Marymounters
No.
are finished.
No, because what Edith and Edgar bear with them into the Puritan community will transform that community. That wreath that they bring with them and the passion that led to their union is a transfiguration of the Puritan community.
But as
So that in a way, the Puritan community can't continue either if it is not refreshed from some kernel of truth that Marymount represents.
So when Endicott says he's softened by the
Yeah.
sight of this couple, he's softened by how they both need and help one another, and especially by their willingness to take the punishment owed to the other, even if it meant death to the self. He's very taken with this. And then he says there's something in the youth that would make him fit to fight and able to toil and even to be pious. And she can become a mother in our Israel and raise up children who have been better bred than she. You think that what they're bringing to the community is something more than what Endicott sees in their possibility?
Yeah, I guess so, or that in this moment he sees it. In other words, the Puritans try to live as a community of souls or a community of spirits, and that also is unsustainable. In other words, you can't live just at the level of the body as the Marymounters do, or you can't live just at the level of the soul as the Puritans do, so that the couple represents, I mean, I learned this from you, Leon. We are compound beings. The high and the low are not disjunct from one another, that this begins in the body but is transmuted into something higher and better, but that the priest of the Puritans himself has to sort of glimpse that or recognize it or make a place for it within this Puritan order.
Well, let's look at the wedding for a moment so that we can return to this a little better informed. Edith and Edgar learned something at their wedding, at the moment of their marriage. What is that something? How do we understand the insight that they share with one another and that they share with us?
the
There's
mystery, why don't we just
Articulate.
read the exchange? Diana, you want to read it?
Edith, sweet lady of the May, whispered he reproachfully, is yon wreath of roses a garland to hang above our graves, that you look so sad? Oh, Edith, this is our golden time. Tarnish it not by any pensive shadow of the mind, for it may be that nothing of futurity will be brighter than the mere remembrance of what is now passing. That was the very thought that saddened me. How came it in your mind, too? Said Edith, in a still lower tone than he, for it was high treason to be sad at Marymount. Therefore do I sigh amid this festive music, and besides, dear Edgar, I struggle as with a dream, and fancy that these shapes of our jovial friends are visionary, and their mirth unreal, and that we are no true Lord and Lady of the May. What is the mystery in my heart? Just then, as if a spell had loosened them, down came a little shower of withering rose leaves from the Maypole. Alas, for the young lovers, no sooner had their hearts glowed with real passion than they were sensible of something vague and unsubstantial in their former pleasures, and felt a dreary presentiment of inevitable change. From the moment that they truly loved, they had subjected themselves to earth's doom of care and sorrow and troubled joy, and had no more a home at Marymount. That was Edith's mystery.
Does this insight give them a home among the Puritans? Is this only something that's missing in Marymount? Or, as Diana suggests, is there something in this insight that is missing among the Puritans, too, and that would transform both communities?
I think there's something that will transform both communities. That they will leave behind what looks like the hypocrisy of Marymount. That's no doubt. But they bring something that the Puritans don't have. And it's something of the combination of body and mind that Diana's speaking to. But it's something even more than that. They bring with them, we're told at the very end, their purest and best of their early joys. That's the time we see joy. The Puritan community is an absolutely loveless community. They bring love and marriage together, or a marriage that is based on love. And while it's not peculiarly American, there is something that will thenceforth, and that whole notion that a marriage can be based on love, that there can be joy within marriage, that is something that they bring to that community.
It's something new for the Puritans? Doesn't Endicott recognize it when he sees it?
Well, I think he recognizes it, he softens. There seems to be a moment of nostalgia there, but something that he had seemed to try to get rid of, to dispel from his way of being. There is no joy in Puritanville.
It says that he saw in them an air of mutual support, of pure affection, seeking aid and giving it, that showed them to be man and wife. Doesn't that suggest that that is already his definition of marriage?
Yeah, but I think maybe that is the definition of marriage, but there's more than that.
But
The pure affection.
But he says, it says here, he smiled at the fair spectacle of early love. He almost sighed for the inevitable blight of early hopes. In other words, that gloom in him goes very,
Right.
very deep, even in the presence of love. Whereas I think there's a kind of suggestion that this can be more lasting with Edith and Edgar.
I mean, I think if one filled this out, you could say that the Puritans' austerity is partly in the service of a view on a better life hereafter. I mean, it's that there is a certain concentration on heaven as the place where those joys will not be disappointed and short-lived. And it's a question, really, whether or not Edith and Edgar, when they go among the Puritans, will in fact bring what they have new and transform the Puritans, or whether they will come to learn what Endicott thinks he has learned in a way about young, hopeful joys. Amy emphasizes a marriage based on love. Another way to put this would be that it's a marriage based on choice, which is an American, appeals very much to at least the other strand of America that is not the Puritan strand that we've talked about in previous sessions and that is in many of the other stories in the book. It's also true that the Puritans came to America as families. They didn't send the men first to set out and find riches and then send for them. They didn't break up the families. So the whole conception of life of the Puritans is not the life of the rugged individual with his rights, seeking his own happiness, but it really is family as the basis of community. Now, whether that family is understood as itself containing a sufficient element of joy to provide for earthly happiness, and that kind of leavening of the dour and grim visage of this community, that I think is what I mean, if you both are right, and I'm inclined to think you are, that Hawthorne sees in Edith and Edgar a kind of correction to the Puritans, which might make the Puritan ethic not only dominant, but something that could enable life to be celebrated here and now, and enable the Republic to flourish. As between the Puritans and the Marymounters, there's no question which one can be sustained. The question is whether it will be sustained in a way that conduces to the happiness as well as to the stability of its inhabitants.
One way I think visually in the story that you see this transformation is the way in which the stocks are replaced by the wreath. So the Puritan impulse is to rely on the stocks, and you
around the head.
circle the head with the stocks, and you use this this mechanism of shame. And at the end, Endicott himself, he's the one who throws the wreath over the two of them together. So it's now something that unites the two of them to the extent that shame still exists. It will be a kind of internalized shame rather than this externalized shame, which is a kind of violation of privacy.
This would provide a kind of really lasting tradition, a different understanding of family, and that is sustainable, that new understanding of family, and that would be a real gift to America. If Hawthorne is trying to find some middle way between these two extremes, that would be a very good way of combining the spirit of religion with the spirit of liberty. To borrow your sense, it's not marriage based on love, but marriage based on love also means marriage based on choice.
I like all of this, but I think the Puritan emphasis on shame deserves at least a cheer and a half, if not two. Yes, they're severe. Nobody on this panel, I think, would like to live under their rule. Fine. But the question is, can you sustain private, robust family life if the external culture is utterly shameless? If you don't have some kind of communal norms that in fact lead people to be ashamed of behaving in certain kind of Marymount-ish ways, except perhaps, you have time for Mardi Gras, or you have various kinds of places of entertainment and festival, so that comes out under some kind of limited auspices. It's too easy, I think, to dismiss as puritanical and oppressive a kind of teaching that suggests how you comport yourself in public, how you hold your body, how you dress, how you speak, affects public life and even affects this little domestic nursery of humanity and nursery of community that the two of you have endorsed, and Yuval and I with you. We are inclined today to think that guilt is bad and shame is worse, and no moral community can do without either.
I think we should talk about Hawthorne and his attitude towards these things, and I see him very much as a critic of the way in which the Puritans handled shame. I mean, of course, not only in this story, but in the Scarlet Letter
yes.
also. And there is something very violative about the stocks because it prevents the natural response of hiding your shame. In other words, it not only shames you, but it forces you to present that shamed face publicly. It doesn't allow you to hide yourself. And so for Hawthorne, this really violates something about a kind of public-private distinction. And the problem with the Puritans is they do not admit of that distinction between public and private. So that he is not against shame or certain uses of shame, but it has to be in the right way, and the Puritans have really erred in that, not just by excess or going too far, but in some really fundamental way.
That's very nice.
There are two things that Hawthorne seems to be responding to, and it's closely connected to what you said the second. Shame is one, but what the Puritans really tried to do is to reform human nature, and that he finds intolerable. And that's why I insisted that love has to come back there.
So that the utopianism is present among the Puritans as it is among the Marymounters, and in that sense, they both show elements of the American kind of aspiration. Let's just start over. It does seem to me that Hawthorne is also a critic of that sort of utopian strand within America.
Both escape to the forest
Right.
for reasons that aren't as different as they think they are.
That's exactly right.
So in that sense, both need the family to be reminded of what it is they think they can change but can't. So is Endicott wrong to think that Edith and Edgar will make good Puritan parents, and or she'll make a good mother and he'll make a good worker and warrior?
I don't think he's wrong. They seem to have a rather deep understanding of the meaning of marriage. And if the meaning of marriage is saying yes to your mortality and to looking ahead to the next generations, and that has something to do with the mystery that she discovers, that is that mystery that she feels at that moment.
Something like this is the lesson here. It seems an awfully universal lesson. Why is it in a book that Americans in particular ought to read? Is it about America, or is it something America needs?
If the question is whether America needs something in addition to the encouragement of individualism to produce the seeds of teachings about how to get along with the other and how to learn the foundations of community and how to learn your duties as well as your rights, the family is for most people the place where that is possible. And it seems to me terribly important, especially for our kind of a polity, that this institution be encouraged, supported, sustained, honored.
I think what Hawthorne shows us is the depth to which these two possibilities, jollity and gloom, go to our native grain, the core of our native grain. This is not a problem that we got rid of either fictionally or historically. You think Woodstock and you think the rise of evangelical religions. You think the hippies versus the establishment. I mean, the caricatures that we get or the satires that we get, they abound. And they're still here. And the tensions that exist, and to find some way of living with both of those things, he's providing us with one way of doing so, and he's embracing, it seems to me, the alternative of marriage based on freedom and love within a religious community or within some kind of religion. But I think that what's really important is to see that we, each of us, have to negotiate those tensions.
In raising up the idea that marriage is the answer to these things, does he mean to suggest that a society founded on ideals, whatever they be, is never finally capable of achieving what it aims to achieve, and in fact is only worthwhile if it can be a home for families? I mean, isn't that a blow to American idealism, good and bad? Is the notion that a nation founded on the pursuit of happiness, or a nation founded on life, liberty, and happiness, or a nation founded on the Mayflower Compact, aren't those more or less equally dismissed here? And the idea in the end is that what you need is a society where a family like this is possible?
I like that. I think you go a little too far. I think that, yes, he is criticizing any society that is simply based on ideology. But I think that if the marriage is based on choice, that is a way of embracing some of the principles of America. If the marriage is made more healthy, living in a religious community or observing a certain kind of order of things, the marriage is healthier.
This is a story and an institution that liberalism needs. That is to say that The self-evident truths of the Declaration, and this I learned from you actually, the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, which I've always regarded as self-evidently true, rest upon a conception of the human being which is self-evidently false. That is to say that we are in the world as isolated individuals rather than as nested in families of origin and in families of perpetuation. That we're not radical isolates. And a community that encourages us to think of ourselves only in terms of our rights and in terms of our own happiness or our own liberty or our own life doesn't have the wherewithal to produce even the necessities of self-defense, never mind the kind of richness of community life or the education of children or the rearing of people of fine character that make for a decent life and not just a mirthful one.
I guess I do think that Hawthorne, as one of our greatest novelists, and many of the other great novelists who are in the book, are really very, very thoughtful critics of the American regime, particularly the creedal part of our regime. And for Hawthorne, it's always a balance. He's got the Marymounters and the Puritans. In the Scarlet Letter begins with the section on the Custom House, which is a criticism of his own time and era, a certain sort of liberalism gone awry, so that he is always bringing a kind of poetic correction to these philosophies, and that poetic correction usually means going back to the passions and to these natural sources of human connection.
That are only contained in the end in the family.
I don't know that I would say only, at least I wouldn't say that for Hawthorne. He also has a sense of the artist and a certain kind of individuality that transcends the regime and involves links to others, but is not a family link. But he is looking for whatever those resources are, and at the level of sort of regular life, that is going to be the family.
The acknowledgement that human nature has to be taken as it is and refined, and not simply deformed in the name of some ideology
reformed.
or creed.
Right, or
And that life in its concreteness, with some of its sort of fundamental passions, have to be honored if you're going to have a community that isn't going to maim the human beings who live among them.
Yeah, I can maybe share here just a one-sentence line from Henry James, who was a wonderful analyst and commentator on Hawthorne. He said, like almost all people who possess in a strong degree the storytelling faculty, Hawthorne had a democratic strain in his composition and a relish for the commoner stuff of human nature.
The commoner stuff of human nature. That's not comus nature.
Right.
It's not the merging with the world, with nature as such. And that's where your point becomes very powerful. I mean, in ordinary life, it would be the family as the unit.
And that teaching in a way can never itself become creedal.
Right.
Because it would distort it to do that. So it seems to me it is up to the poets to maintain that.
Being a citizen of America is much more than affirming certain abstract propositions, whether of the Declaration of Independence or of various religious sorts. It is to practice a life of self-government lived in families, small communities, larger communities, voluntary associations, and the like. It requires filling the moral imagination and the sentiments with certain kinds of teaching that enrich the possibilities for everyday life. And the people who show us these characters struggling to live such a life are not the philosophers and not the historians, but really the storytellers, the poets, the songwriters, and to some extent, those of our statesmen who had the gift of poetry, Abraham Lincoln, first, second, and third among them.
Hence the power of a book like this. Thank you all very much.